Since it's the month of love, I thought I would do a little mini series where I share some of the books that I love. And today I am sharing 5 of my favorite female authors of the 20th century. Hello book friends, I'm Jen and welcome to my reading life and welcome to a video all about some of my favorite female authors of the 20th century. I pulled 5 of my favorite authors off of my shelves and I'm going to talk through their books with you, and then I'm going to share my top 3 recommendations for where to start if you've never read these authors before. Grab yourself a warm beverage and let us find out who made my list. I made that sound very dramatic about who these potential 5 female authors are from the 20th century that have made my favorites list, but I think none of these are going to come as any surprise to anyone who's been watching my channel for any length of time. I think I'm just going to go through these kind of in the order I discovered them, though the first 3 authors, I think I discovered them all right around the same time, so I could be a little bit off in this. The first author on my list is Mary Stuart, and I discovered Mary Stuart through my mom. I discovered quite a few of these through my mom, but I discovered her because my mom recommended that I try reading her Merlin trilogy because I was going through a bit of an obsession with King Arthur. And so I promptly found the books and read them and devoured them. There's actually, I believe, a couple more in the Merlin series, which I can't remember if I've read or not. I might have read the 4th book, and I think there might be a 5th book, and that one I know I haven't read, but I have read every other book by Mary Stuart. So the Merlin trilogy consists of The Crystal Cave, The Hollow Hills, and The Last Enchantment. And then I think The Wicked Day is the next one after this. And I did read The Wicked Day, but there might be one more after that one, and that one is the one I haven't read. Actually, it's funny because apparently at some point I went through and I checked off a bunch of the books of hers that I had read. It's a very old list. I've read much more than that now, but that's kind of funny. Anyway, I really loved this series. My books are so old. Can you see, like, the pages are so yellowed. No acid-free paper in this edition. But I just really fell in love with this whole series, and she is a fantastic writer. And so from there, then I learned, actually, I think my mom might have had one of her romantic suspense novels on our bookshelves in our home. And that was probably the first one I read. Can I recall which book that was? No, I cannot. It might have been 9 Coaches Waiting. Actually, yes, I think it was 9 Coaches Waiting. This is my edition of 9 Coaches Waiting, or one of them anyway. I also have quite a few of them up here. No, I don't have 9 Coaches Waiting. So these books along here are also Mary Stuart's. I'm collecting these Hodder editions, and I really want to have all of them, but I don't quite yet. But I do have also these vintage paperbacks. So let me just go through all of the vintage paperbacks I have. Some of these I got when I worked in a bookstore in college. So 9 Coaches Waiting was one of those. Touch Not the Cat, Wildfire at Midnight, Thunder on the Right, Madam, Will You Talk, and Thorny Hold. And then these last 2 are 2 that I just found recently. The first one was A Walk in Wolf Wood, and then also this is another copy of Madam, Will You Talk. And I have read all of these. And then my Hodder Books collection consists of My Brother Michael, The Gabriel Hounds, Touch Not the Cat, The Moon Spinners, The Wind Off the Small Isles and The Lost One, The Ivy Tree, and Airs Above the Ground. I'm just a huge fan of Mary Stuart's writing. I think she does romantic suspense unlike anybody else. I absolutely adore her, and I have read and reread many of her books. But my top 3 recommendations, if you have never read Mary Stuart before, Well, first off, one little caveat. If you are interested in the King Arthur legend, then I definitely recommend her Merlin series, but that is sort of its own thing. To be honest, I don't think you can go wrong by picking up any of her books, but the three that I recommend starting with are either The Moon Spinners, and again, I think this is one of her books that is fantastic because it takes place in an exotic location. In this one, we find ourselves in Crete, and we are always following a young girl who has found herself in a somewhat dramatic situation and has to figure a way out of it. And I think this is a fantastic example of Mary Stewart's writing, and you really, really can't go wrong. And I think it makes a perfect summer read if you're looking for something to read this summer. Next up, I recommend My Brother Michael. This is another one that takes place in a more exotic locale. This time we are in Athens, and in this one, our young heroine takes a ride from somebody and gets involved in something unexpected, and you follow her along on her adventure. There are thrills and chills and chases, and I really feel like Mary Stewart writes a denouement like nobody's business, and I can't believe more of her books haven't been made into movies because I think they would be excellent movies. And then if you're not quite in the mood for romantic suspense and you'd like something that's a little more domestic in nature, then I recommend Thornyhold. And Thornyhold takes place in England, and we are following a young woman who has inherited a cottage from her aunt, I believe, and she goes there to make her home there. And this has kind of hints a little bit of magical realism, but if magical realism isn't your thing, don't worry. It's not going to go real deep into that, but there's a little bit of mystery. But this is a much quieter, more homey, cozy feeling book, so if that's what you're in the mood for, then definitely give Thornyhold a try. And then my next favorite female author from the 20th century has to be Helene Hanff. Most of you will know her from 84 Charing Cross Road, which is one of my favorite books of all time. It is a fantastic epistolary book. It is nonfiction though, so it's not a novel. It is Helene's actual correspondence that she had with some booksellers in London, and it is so delightful. If you haven't read it, absolutely give it a go. But she also wrote a number of other nonfiction books as well, and I have, I think, all but one of them. So next is the sequel to 84 Charing Cross Road, which is The Duchess of Bloomsbury Street. Oh, my poor edition is coming apart here a little bit at the seams, but this is when Helene actually finally makes it to London and gets to visit 84 Charing Cross Road, and it is just lovely. So if you want to do a little bit of armchair traveling to England, I definitely recommend this one, but definitely read 84 Charing Cross Road first because you won't have the same experience with this one if you haven't read this one. And then next up is a sort of prequel to 84 Charing Cross Road, and that is Q's Legacy. And in this, we find out how 84 Charing Cross Road came to be when Helene Hanff stumbles upon a volume of lectures by Sir Arthur Quiller Couch. That is the Q of Q's Legacy. And she really wants to find out more about him and find more of his work. And that is what kind of prompts her to reach out to this bookseller in England to try and find copies of his books. And so there we have the correspondence that we find in 84 Charing Cross Road. It's been a long time since I've read this one. I think I'm due for a reread pretty soon. And then next up are a couple of books that are about Helene's life living in New York City. And the first is Apple of My Eye. And I really enjoyed this book. You get a real close-up look at New York City and about her life there. And it's very much of its time for sure. So if you want a little like snapshot of New York City, I think this is a great book to give you that. Same thing goes for Letter from New York, which was recently republished by Manderley Press. And this is a delightful series of, Helene wrote these little like radio broadcasts for the BBC all about her life in New York, and they've been turned into a volume, and so you can read them now. She was only supposed to do it for a short period of time, and I think she ended up doing it for 6 years. So yeah, it was supposed to last 6 months, ended up being 6 years. You get to see Helene Hanf's life in New York and learn about her neighbors, all of the dogs that live in her building and in her neighborhood. And you get to kind of get an idea of what her apartment was like, which is so fascinating. I wonder if you can find photos of her apartment online anywhere. I may have to do a little deep dive into that because I would love to see what her apartment actually looked like, because it sounds very, very interesting. Very small, very compact, and she has a really fun way of kind of dealing with having such a small place to live and still keeping all of her things and throwing parties. And I really loved hearing all about those little vignettes in her life, and this is delightful. And then the only book of hers that I don't have, which I used to have, and I don't know what happened to my copy, which is Underfoot in Show Business. And if I remember correctly, I think that book is about, she somehow gets involved, either she's going to, with like a play or something that's being produced. I don't know if she's written it or she's asked to help out. I don't know. I will put a link to that book in the description box so that you can read the description of it yourself. But when I was really into theater and I was going to be a theater major in college initially, I really loved that book. So if you like theater and Broadway, then I definitely recommend checking that one out. Obviously, Helene Hanf didn't write nearly as many books as Mary Stuart did, so I think it's easier to decide which of her books to read. Of course, you must read 84 Charing Cross Road if you're going to read Helene Hanf. Please start here. This is absolutely the book to start with. And then definitely follow it up with The Duchess of Bloomsbury Street, because it is such a wonderful just rounding out of the story and kind of tying up all the loose ends. And then I definitely think I recommend A Letter from New York, which is just such a lovely little look at her life in New York City. And I thoroughly enjoyed this. But again, I mean, you really can't go wrong with either of these either. So once you've read 84 Charing Cross Road and Bloomsbury Street, then go crazy. And then next up, this author will come as no surprise to anyone, but of course I had to include Laurie Colwin. She is definitely one of my very favorite authors, if not my very favorite author of all time. And I have every book that she ever wrote in multiple editions. And so I'm just going to share one edition of each of her books here. I have Happy All the Time. Next, I have Goodbye Without Leaving, Family Happiness, A Big Storm Knocked It Over, The Lone Pilgrim, Passion and Affect, Another Marvelous Thing, Shine On, Bright and Dangerous Object, Home Cooking, and More Home Cooking. Clearly, I love Laurie. She was taken from us too soon. So again, she didn't get to give us as many books as she potentially could have, but we must enjoy what she did leave for us. She wrote 5 full-length novels, 3 short story collections, and 2 nonfiction. If you want to give Laurie Colwin a try, then here are the 3 books I recommend starting with. First off, of course, has to be my favorite novel by her, and that is Happy All the Time. In this, we follow 2 couples, Holly and Guido and Vincent and Misty, and we follow them from before their relationships start. We sort of start with Vincent and Guido. They are cousins, and then we see them both meeting their love interests and then watch how their relationships develop. And actually, it's really funny because when I first read this book, I think I really identified with Guido and Holly's love story. But as I have aged and gotten more mature, I really think I resonate more with Vincent and Misty. And I just love their relationship. And but both of them, they're so charming. There's so much just loveliness in this book. And if you are interested in a snapshot of New York in the 1970s, then give Happy All the Time a try. If you would prefer to read a nonfiction book, then I highly, highly, highly recommend Home Cooking by Laurie Colwin. Her food memoirs are just the most delectable, delightful, wonderful collections of food writing that I have ever come across. She was writing about food before food writing was really a thing, at least kind of in this format as a memoir. And I just love these books. They are so cozy, they're so homey, they're so warm and inviting. And if you like home cooking, then immediately get yourself more home cooking. But I cannot recommend these enough. They are absolutely wonderful. Laurie Colwin will have your mouth watering. Make sure you have a snack handy when you pick this up. And then lastly, I'm going to recommend one other novel of hers, and that is A Big Storm Knocked It Over. And in this, we follow Jane Louise Parker, and we watch her arc from a young single woman through being a married mother. And I just really enjoy this. I think it is a lovely story about relationships, about what it's like to redefine yourself as your roles in life change, from being a single person taking care of just yourself to being a wife to being a mother, or whatever the roles are that you're taking on in your life. I think sometimes it's difficult to transition into those. And I think Laurie Colwin is very astute about what that feels like. And I think this is just a lovely novel, and I can't recommend it enough. And then one more little Laurie Colwin tidbit that I wanted to share is that I recently discovered some new editions that have been put out of Laurie's books, and they're going to be releasing more titles, but these are the first 3 titles that they have put out. The first is Happy All the Time, of course, and then Family Happiness, and then Another Marvelous Thing. And I just love these covers. They're so beautiful. Just love the kind of pastels. These have been put out by W&N Essentials. But yes, I just had to share my new Laurie Colwin additions to my collection. And then my next favorite 20th century female writer has to be Rosamund Pilcher, of course. How could I not talk about one of the coziest, most wonderfully comforting, and I'm at a loss for words, clearly. I love Rosamund Pilcher, and I think her books are just incredibly wonderful. Not all of them are 100% my favorites, but all of her long novels, for sure, I absolutely love. So here we have The Shell Seekers, which was the first book of hers that I read and absolutely adored and led me to read everything else I could get my hands on by her. And then her other big books are Coming Home, Winter Solstice, and September. And then next I have just a variety of some of her shorter books and her short story collections. So I have The Blue Bedroom and Other Stories, which are short stories. I have Snow in April, which is another shorter novel. Wild Mountain Thyme, again, this is another shorter novel. I have The Carousel and Voices in Summer, which are 2 shorter, like novella length almost books. And then I have this bind up called A Time to Remember, which features 2 novels, The Empty House and The Day of the Storm. Again, these are shorter novels. And then I do have 2 unread short story collections by her. I think the first one is called A Place Like Home. That was fairly recently published. And then I think it's called Another View. And I think that might be the last 2 of her work I have to read. I'll have to look into that. But I have read quite a bit by her. I don't think I can narrow it down to 3 books by Rosamund Pilcher, so I'm actually going to give you 5. And though I am going to recommend 2 that I think are great to really start with, and then the other 3 you could read after whichever of these 2 you pick up first. Like I said, my very first book by her was The Shell Seekers, and I think this is a fantastic book. It makes a great summer read. So if you want something really chunky to take with you on vacation, to the beach, just to read on long summer days, this is the book I recommend. It is fantastic. We follow Penelope Keeling in this, and she's in her 60s, and we kind of flash back to her life and kind of watch her as she goes from being a young woman to being married and being a mother and then a grandmother, and we just kind of see her throughout her life. And The Shell Seekers refers to her father was a painter, and there is a painting called The Shell Seekers, and there is a storyline about that. That's all I'm going to say. And then the next book I recommend is Coming Home. And in this one's more, I think, almost of like a coming of age story. And in this we follow Judith Dunbar. And Judith is left at boarding school in the mid 1930s by her parents, and she makes friends with this other girl at the school whose name is Loveday Carey Lewis. And Loveday kind of sweeps Judith into her life, and Judith kind of becomes part of Loveday's family, and we just get to follow Judith along throughout a good chunk of her life, and I absolutely adored this book. It's really hard for me to decide if this or Shell Seekers is my favorite, but I highly recommend, depending on kind of what you're looking for. If you'd like an older protagonist, then I definitely recommend starting with the Shell Seekers. If you want something that's more like coming of age, then definitely begin with Coming Home. And then if you want something to read in the winter time, then I definitely recommend Winter Solstice. This is the perfect winter read. It is just lovely. We have in this a bit of like a found family story, bunch of people coming together at the holidays who are a bit lost. Some of them don't really have places to go. There has been some tragedy. There is a tragedy at the beginning of this, so if you might be worried about that, then definitely look up what that is before you begin this. Rosamund Pilcher isn't completely just light and fluffy. There are some darker elements to her stories, but I think she does it in a way that doesn't make it feel super heavy. And I think you always find family and community and connection in her books, and that's what I really love about them, and that's what you'll find in this one. It is a fantastic winter read. Next is her last of her big chunky novels, and that is September. And definitely read this one after you read the Shell Seekers, because we do have a character from the Shell Seekers who shows up in September, and I think it's important to know his backstory before you meet him again in September. This is actually a great book to read anytime from May through September, because it starts in May, ends in September. Anytime in that period would be great to read this book. I just reread it last year, and I actually ended up loving it more than I did the first time I read it. So this is a book that has definitely grown on me, and I definitely recommend it. And then lastly, I just want to put in one little plug. If you want to read a short story collection by Rosamund Pilcher, then I think you should start with The Blue Bedroom. This is such an amazing collection. I didn't find a single story in here that I did not like or love. I gave this 5 stars, which is rare for me in short story collections. I thought this was absolutely fantastic, and I'm definitely going to be reading it again. Should I reread it this year? No, I'm going to read her other 2 short story collections that I haven't read yet. Then maybe next year I'll treat myself and read this one again, but loved it. And then my final favorite female author of the 20th century has to be D.E. Stevenson. I adore D.E. Stevenson, but I only discovered her a couple of years ago when I had broken my wrist and I really needed something just light and comforting to read. And I was able to get Miss Bunkle's book on my Kindle because it was much easier to read on my Kindle when my wrist was first broken and I really couldn't do much, and holding a book was just really challenging. And I just blazed through this book. I absolutely adored it, and I went on to read the rest of the Miss Bunkle series and beyond. So let me go through the D.E. Stevenson books I have read, of course, starting with Miss Bunkle's book. And then, of course, I had to read the sequel, Miss Bunkle Married, which I absolutely adored as well. And then next in that series is the 2 Mrs. Abbotts. And then it wraps up with the 4 Graces. Then next up, I read Charlotte Fairley. And then next I read a trilogy, which starts with Victoria Cottage, continues with Music in the Hills, and concludes with Winter and Rough Weather. And then I also read the first Mrs. Tim book, which is Mrs. Tim and the Regiment, which is a really challenging book to find here in the US. And so I actually ended up listening to that one on audio, but I absolutely loved it, which is a good thing because I have the remaining 3 books on my TBR. So there is Mrs. Tim Carries On, Mrs. Tim Gets a Job, and Mrs. Tim Flies Home. And I'm really hoping to get to those this year. And I'm actually currently reading a little duology. I just listened to the audiobook of Belle Lamington, And then I'm currently listening to the sequel to Belle Lamington, which is Fletcher's End. And I won't say too much about it because you should read Belle Lamington first and just kind of go into them blind. But I am loving Fletcher's End maybe even more than Belle Lamington. And yes, that is absolutely a delightful little duology. In terms of where to start with D.E. Stevenson, well, I don't think you can go wrong by starting where I started, which is with Miss Bunkle's book. Now, this book is very light. And Miss Bunkle is quite the character, and she lives in a village, and she's actually writing a book based entirely upon all of the people in her village. And the book gets published, but nobody knows who the author is. And yes, it is just a lot of fun. And Miss Bunkle is such a quirky, lovely character. And I absolutely adored this book. And then Miss Bunkle married. It's so hard for me to say, but I feel like I loved it just a smidge more, maybe because, I'd gotten to know Miss Bunkle so well in this book. And then when she gets married, it's just like so much more of a good thing. So I highly recommend both of them. If you want something that's a little bit more of like a slice of English village life, then I definitely recommend Victoria Cottage. In this, we follow Carolyn Daring, and she has 3 grown children, and she lives in her small village. And it's really just a slice of life. We get to see all of the different people who live in the village. We get to meet Carolyn's sister, who's an actress, and we get to see her interacting with her children. And it's just so lovely. I love Carolyn Daring. I want to be friends with her. I want to live next door to her and have tea with her and just chit chat. And she's just such a lovely character. And then lastly, if you're looking for a place to start with D.E. Stevenson, then I definitely think Mrs. Tim of the Regiment is a great place to start. I think if you really enjoyed something like The Diary of a Provincial Lady, that you will really, really love Mrs. Tim. It's got a very similar tone. It's also written in sort of diary journal format. And I just think it is absolutely lovely. And I cannot wait to read the rest of the series. And I'm really hoping to get to it this year because I just feel like I want to have a little bit of D.E. Stevenson in like most of my reading months this year. And that is it. Those are 5 of my favorite 20th century female writers. I did forget to say at the beginning that I did pick these writers based on the fact that they were published during the 20th century and that they had not written outside of the 20th century. So while their books may be being republished now, they are no longer alive and writing in the 21st century. So that was sort of my criteria that I used when I decided what qualified as a 20th century female writer. I also really wanted to pick, obviously, writers that I was very familiar with and whose work I have read quite extensively. Obviously, I still have quite a ways to go with D.E. Stevenson, and if you have any recommendations for others of her books, which I didn't talk about today, but that I should definitely add to my TBR, then definitely let me know that. Let's chat down in the comments. Who are some of your favorite 20th century female writers? Do we share any similar ones? And have you read any of the books I talked about today? Do you have any favorites from the ones that I shared? Any different books that you'd recommend as your top 3 from any of these authors that I didn't mention? But if you don't have anything that you'd like to add in the comments, but you'd like to let me know that you were here because comments really do help my channel, why don't you leave a little female person emoji of whatever kind you would like, just to let me know that you were here. Like I said, comments really do help, and I love to see that you were here, that you watched the video, and you made it this far. And if you did enjoy this video, if you could give it a like and hit that subscribe button if you aren't already subscribed, I would love to have you join my bookish community. And for those of you who hit the super thanks button on my last video, thank you again for that little bit of extra support. I really do appreciate it. And I'll be back with another video very soon. Bye.